Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for the very first episode of Inflection Point Podcast in 2024. As you know, or maybe you're just now finding out, that this is the spot where we are dedicated to the art of listening and authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of self-awareness and understanding and personal transformation and ultimately social impact. So I'm your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail. And by the way, Happy New Year, everybody.
Yes, Happy New Year. I'm Mavis Bauman.
Happy New Year, and I'm Gail Hunter.
Excellent, excellent. So our theme for 2024 is community conversations. So throughout most of this year, our work, our topics and everything are in one way or another going to be related to this idea of having these community conversations. We still plan to have guests, but we're looking specifically for guests that are kind of involved in the work that they do, is involved directly in community conversation of one sort or another. So we're going to open up this discussion, and Gail's going to lead us in a conversation. So what is the big deal with community conversations? So at this point, I'll pass the mic over to Gail.
So what is the big deal? Well, there's a big deal about it. Michael Halt is the founder of the Liminal School of Self-Directed Adult Learning, and he defines community conversations as a process designed to be a simple and sociable, informal conversation in which a small group of people come together to get to know one another in a more meaningful way than they usually do, by talking about their sense of personal purpose in their lives and their community, about the issues that are of personal priority and concern. The goal is for everyone to be open and curious about all perspectives and see what we learn from one another, rather than to debate any particular topic or issue or make sure that you're the one that comes out being right. The American Libraries Association also has a similar mission that is to provide leadership for the development and promotion and improvement of library and information services. And the profession of librarianship, in order to enhance learning and ensure access to information for all, is a priority for them. They also have a Libraries Transforming Community program. It's an initiative of the ALA that seeks to strengthen the role of librarians as core community leaders and also agents of change. The LTC addresses a critical need within the library field by developing and distributing new tools, resources, and support for librarians to engage with their communities in new ways. One of the ways is through this community conversation. And the LTC actually has a community conversation workbook that's online that you can download, which is pretty impressive. So what is community conversations? Well, there are two more significant and important purposes. They're a turned outward way to authentically engage members of the community, and they generate public knowledge that can be used to inform decision making of all kinds. They also help the community to understand people's aspirations for the community, their concerns. They're to help them to be able to think and talk about a given issue and the changes needed to reach any aspiration for that community. Now, there are some rules or guidelines to this, and that's what can be very challenging and difficult. What's interesting is that these basic rules have been around for a long time. They're called empathic or reflective listening skills. They are are really about focusing on what the speaker is saying instead of focusing on what's in your mind and what you want to say in a reaction to or as a response to. So the number one guideline is to be curious and be open to learning. And so that everybody has the ability to teach another and everybody has an ability to learn from another, right? So to be open and to be curious means that we listen, trying to hear all the points of view, and we try to maintain an attitude of exploration and learning. The other guideline is a balanced advocacy and inquiry. That seeks to learn to understand as much as you want to pursue, but the conversation is much about listening as it is about talking. The other criteria guideline is to show respect and suspend judgment. How many of us, when we are listening to somebody, are thinking in our head, not just that response that we want to say, but are we judging the other person? Are we really hearing what they're saying instead of what we want to say about that? Most of us don't hear and listen in that way, that we really are focused and curious about what the other person has to say. So to do that, we have to suspend our judgment. And as I said, we tend to judge one another. And it's really important in these conversations to not do that, to set that aside. Because then it gives you more ability to learn from others and to contribute to the other's experience through the respect and feeling appreciated. The goal, another guideline or goal, is to seek alignment rather than agreement. And alignment is a shared intention, whereas agreement is having a shared belief or opinion. In this conversation, they look for alignment primarily and simply appreciate that everyone will disagree on some beliefs and opinions, and hopefully be able to agree on some beliefs and opinions too. So that kind of gives you a brief understanding of what that is about. So the LTC and the Community Conversations Workbook is also supported by the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation, and which is creating a counterforce in society powered by community-led change. There's a quote from the website that says, "Our task is to get on a more equitable, fair, just, inclusive, and hopeful path forward." And I believe we can only do that through this type of listening and communication.
Excellent. Wonderful, Gail. So thank you for bringing us up to speed on and just answering that question. What is the big deal about community conversations? And as you can see, based on some of the resources that you mentioned, it really is a big deal.
Yes, it is a big deal. I mean, it can really generate trust among community members. It can share ideas. It can be able to solidify ideas and be able to work cooperatively. And the more people that are working cooperatively, the higher the chances of actually achieving the goal that you have in that community. So it is a big deal. I think the skills that it's teaching are the biggest part of it, right? To be able to really communicate through listening, not just through talking.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm glad you used the word skills, because one of the things that I do in my life professionally is that I am an on-call facilitator for CCL, which is the Center for Creative Leadership. Right. And one of the programs that I love to deliver is Better Conversations Every Day. And it's based on these 4 principles, but the very first principle is around listening. And it's listening intentionally, but listening where your purpose is to understand. And so there's a lot of challenge in doing that type of work, which you just mentioned, in terms of people literally being able to step out of themselves and really tune their ear to hear what this individual that they're listening to, whoever that speaker is, to really hear, but not just to hear so that I can refute what they're saying or that I can have a rebuttal to what they're saying. But your intention is to really understand whether their perspective or their experience or their narrative is different from your own is not really the point. The point is you're taking the time out to truly listen. And if you, Gail, I know you, I think both of you might remember this when we did the anti-racism mastermind and the anti-racism workshop. And one of the things that I talked about is this idea of a coin, Every single coin has two sides to the same coin, right? But those sides look very different. And so when you're in that place of making a decision that I want to step onto the side of the coin that is resided by a group of people that I may not necessarily be connected to or be aware of or have an understanding of. So it helps you to broaden your own self-awareness, your own understanding. What is that thing that I always say? You don't know what you don't know.
That's right.
Until you start digging around within yourself, digging around in historical documents, digging around in shows like this or other examples of individuals who are putting information out there for you to really understand that there's a lot of stuff that might be impacting me that you're not even aware of.
Well,
right?
And imagine what that feels like to really have somebody hear you and to understand, to really listen with that respect and non-judgment. Yeah, to feel that heard. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm just loving this idea of community conversations. And I'm just so delighted that we made the choice that community conversations is going to be the primary topic that we focus on throughout the entire year. And so I want to kind of step deeper into the idea of community conversations. And what I decided I wanted to do was use Kwanzaa, right? If you know anything about Kwanzaa, we just kind of celebrated the 7 days, which occur in between Christmas and New Year's, and there's these 7 principles. But the whole idea around Kwanzaa, that is literally communication, community conversation, right? And so we're going to dig a little bit into what the Nguzo Saba means from that perspective of it being about community conversation. So I'm going to start off just by giving our folks a little bit of insight into what actually is Kwanzaa, where did it come from? So there's lots of, people see it in different kinds of ways and all of that, but I'm going to take the liberty of kind of presenting it to you based on how I see the celebration and how I see how it connects into this idea of community conversation. So Dr. Maulana Karenga, a noted Black American scholar and activist, is the one who actually created Kwanzaa in 1966. And he's a professor and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at California State University, I should say, in Long Beach. So Kwanzaa is this Swahili word that means first fruits, but it's more than just a week-long celebration in between Christmas and New Year's. It is a community conversation that is happening on a larger scale. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit more of why am I saying that? Like, what does that even mean? And then we're going to actually describe 2 of the Kwanzaa principles. And as we move into additional episodes, we will go through the entire list of the Kwanzaa principles. And hopefully by the time we've done that, people will have a better sense of how this can help to drive community conversations. So I read an article in the December 2017 article from theconversation.com. And the article was written by Frank Dobson, who is the Associate Dean of Students at Vanderbilt University. And he described what Kwanzaa means for Black Americans. So here are some of what he had to say. Each day of Kwanzaa is devoted to celebrating the 7 basic values of African culture, or the Nguzo Saba, which in Swahili means the 7 principles. The principles are unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. And on each day, a candle is lit. So it's either a red candle or a green candle that is lit on each day to celebrate each one of these principles. So there's it's a Kanara is what the stand is called. And so it's got the 7 candles on it. It's got 3 black and 3 red. I'm sorry, 3 red and 3 green. And there's a black candle in the middle. So the red and the green are lit as you go through the first 6 days. And then on the 7th day, the black candle is lit. Okay. And also gifts are given and different things are shared and food and all of that. So that's sort of the celebratory aspect of it, in terms of the individual principles and what is happening over the course of those 7 days. But let's look a little bit deeper into the history of that. And what is that rooted in? As I mentioned earlier, it was established in 1966. So I think we're all kind of familiar with what was going on in this country in the 60s, right? So we're talking the civil rights movement, we're talking the Black Power movement. And then Professor Keith Mays, a scholar of African-American history at the University of Minnesota, said this: for Black Power activists, Kwanzaa was just as important as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kwanzaa was their answer to what they understood as the ubiquity of white cultural practices that oppressed them as thoroughly as had Jim Crow. So just thinking about that and how this 7-day holiday has its roots in the struggles of the 60s and the 70s, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. There's power in that, right? So Mavis and Gail, when you think about that from that perspective of the 60s and 70s, so how does Kwanzaa now resonate with you? So I'm operating under the assumption that neither one of you has ever actually celebrated Kwanzaa. Is that a correct assumption?
That is correct for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So given that you now have a little bit of a more understanding of the roots of Kwanzaa and those 7 principles that I just mentioned, so how does it resonate with you in terms of this connection to the 60s and the 70s, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement?
I'm game to chime in here.
Yeah.
I am so excited about this. Really, until the last few days, I knew really nothing about Kwanzaa. And in thinking about the feelings I had when I first heard of it, I think I kind of connected it with the negative images of Black Power.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I study it a little bit, it's kind of a structure for community conversations to help Black people reacquaint themselves with their identity. They were removed from their culture, from their identity, from their purpose, from their connections and all sorts of things. So this Kwanzaa gave them a way to come back together, have those conversations, celebrate, and reaffirm their identity. And I mean, that's all good. That is all a good thing. So I found it really fascinating. Does that answer your question, Anita? I kind of got off on my own.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I just wanted to get kind of a sense of you personally, given the fact that we've been working together and we're on this anti-racism journey. I just wanted you to share with the audience what it meant for you in terms of now making that connection and getting a little bit more understanding of what Kwanzaa is and how it connects into the 60s and 70s and what was going on there. So Gail, your thoughts?
It resonates with me for the 60s and 70s and what was going on then. The principles, I love it. I mean, it's really, they're describing identity characteristics of Black people, obviously, but they're such special qualities. And to me, it also depicts resiliency and that truth can't be hidden forever, right? And needs to be celebrated. And that's what Kwanzaa is. It's a celebration of all it is, right?
Absolutely. It is that celebration. And what we're talking about also is moving it out of that context of
Right.
it just being a celebration to bringing it into something that has a potential to contribute to meaningful
Right.
change.
Yeah. And it
Right.
reestablishes community.
Mhm.
It seems to me, embracing these 7 principles and coming together, teaching children about them, reestablishes a community of African Americans.
Well,
And I
principles.
think that we just got to be so helpful for, all ages.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So for Kwanzaa this year in 2023, I started a series of blog posts on the placetostore.com, which is my main website. And under the broad title of the hidden potential of Kwanzaa principles. And I included some of my own personal experiences. And so what we're going to do as we move forward, and actually starting here, we're going to start with the first 2 principles. And I'm going to talk about the principle of umoja, which is unity. So there's a Swahili word, and then there's the English translation of that. So umoja and then unity is what that word stands for. And so the definition of that is to strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, and nation and race. So given my own background, I have participated in Kwanzaa celebrations. I can't say like every single year, but this year alone, I recently, last Friday, as a matter of fact, was at a Kwanzaa celebration here in Pittsburgh on the community called the Hill District. Right. So I've done it either it's usually been in family or in the community, or even had experiences with my church. And I've always been intrigued by these 7 principles. And it's not just about celebrating at a designated time on the calendar, but really practicing these principles as a way of life and as strategies. I see as strategies for anti-racism, equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So when you analyze the building of thriving Black communities, such as Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or the Rosewood community in Florida, or the community, we had talked about the community surrounding the Homer G. Phillips Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. These principles were a part of the social, health, and economic architecture that made those communities successful. So if you think about Greenwood and the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street, the foundation of that was laid when African Americans migrated to Oklahoma from the South. So you think back to the Great Migration and how there were swaths of people that were literally leaving the South and branching out, going up north and out towards the Midwest and everything. One of those individuals was a gentleman by the name of Ottawa G. Gurley. He was also known as O.W. Gurley. And he was one of the early settlers arriving in Tulsa in 1905. And he purchased 40 acres of land and developed the People's Grocery Store and a one-story rooming house. And this initial land development is what set the stage for a thriving Black community that became the home to doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs with businesses ranging from restaurants to hotels, pool halls, shoe stores, tailor shops, and so much more. Like all of those things that you need in your community for that community to thrive, particularly in the time period in which we are talking. And as the forces of segregation began to mount after Oklahoma became a state in, I think it was 1907, 1907, deeply uniting the community and creating this an economic hub for the Black dollar to circulate as residents earned and spent their money almost entirely in Greenwood. So you have these forces of segregation But those forces of segregation actually produced this community that was based on unity, that was based on sharing dollars within the community, helping the community to thrive. The basis of that was unity. And that's why I wanted to kind of use Greenwood as that example. We've done this in the past. We can do this again. That is my firm belief, is that we can do this again. And I think now is the time to strive for that state of mind and that level of Black unity in our families, in our communities, in entrepreneurship, as we enter into this new year. And we do it all for the sake of our children. Like, if you know what Inflection Point Podcast is rooted in, it's rooted in my desire to have a different future for my 3-year-old grandson, Cairo. So Mavis and Gail, how does that resonate with you in terms of this aspect of unity and looking at it through the lens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Greenwood Black Wall Street community? So tell me how does that feel for you?
Well, I think it's exactly what happened in Greenwood, and also in St. Louis at the Chief Phillips Hospital, and that whole area around the hospital. It was about unity and self-sufficiency and cooperation. And I mean, I could go on and on with the adjectives, right? But yes, it was about unity. Yeah, that was a community that was created by Black people for Black people, and they thrived. They were extremely successful and provided everything that anybody needed. Right.
Exactly. And I think about that community. I can also look at in the city of Pittsburgh, the Hill District community. Right. The Hill District at one time was a thriving Black community.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So Mavis, your thoughts?
I just keep hearing the words that there's power in unity, and a very positive power. Mm-hmm. You know, I've been around a lot of white people recently. And there's often this kind of reaction that this kind of power, this kind of forward movement is to the exclusion of white people. That, like, if we have a community that is thriving and is full of Black businesses supporting each other, that somehow that pushes white people out. And I just think this is just totally wrong. This is totally a way to success for Black people, to getting over exclusion, to getting over, any kind of sort of perceived dependency, that Black people have everything white people have in terms of talent and genius, as you say. Let them move ahead. Let them move ahead. And there's power in coming together. There's more sharing of ideas. There's all those synergies that come together. So I'm just thinking power in unity.
Exactly. That is exactly the point. And that is exactly what was demonstrated. Look at these thriving Black communities. Mm-hmm. But also when you look at those, like, everybody by now ought to know the story of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and how the iron fist, I call it the iron fist of white supremacy and segregation and all of that, ended up producing, if you will, a massacre that burned down, killed, destroyed an entire community.
That unity was threatening.
That unit exactly
makes no sense. Which makes no sense.
Thank you. That unity, the idea of unity, and that level of economic power, that level of just a community power, people felt threatened by that. But if you can look at that through so many different things that happened throughout history where that was demonstrated. Like, this Black community cannot be doing better than this white community. And it's always this comparison, whereas for the Black community, it was really, we built our own, we created our own, we worked within our own.
And it wasn't to the exclusion, if I'm not mistaken,
that could come in.
go to their
Exactly.
restaurants, shop at their stores. They could participate in supporting that community.
Exactly.
And the
Exactly.
reverse
So,
was not true. Yeah.
and that's a really good point, because the bottom line is laws of segregation didn't come from Black people.
Right. No,
Right.
It came
Right.
from white people.
right.
But to your point, Mavis, there was nothing that was preventing a white person from coming into Tulsa, Oklahoma, and purchasing there. The only thing that would have stopped them was their own mindset that said,
Right.
this is a Black community.
Right.
I'm not going there. They do their thing. I do my thing. Right.
They don't like me. They don't want me there. You know, the assumptions that people
Exactly.
made for hundreds of years. Right.
So let's
Exactly.
do something
Cool.
out if I can. Just for a
So
second.
hold that thought, Gail, because we really need to take
Take
a
a break. Okay.
really quick break. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll continue this conversation. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast and our first community conversation of 2024. Our topic is the hidden potential of the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. And at this point, I'm going to pass the mic over to Mavis, and she's going to share some of her thoughts on the second principle.
I will go ahead with that in a moment, but I think we asked Gail to hold her thought. Did you want
Oh,
to
that is right. That is right.
Did you
My
wanna
apologies.
say something there, Gail, first before I delve in?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to mention something about the difference between power and empowerment. And I think that what people experienced in Tulsa was empowerment. What white people came in and tried to do was power. They tried to power over that. But the goal was empowerment, and that's what was achieved. I think that's the goal for all of us, is empowerment.
And that's a better word with unity than power, isn't it?
Yeah.
Empowerment. Yeah, that's a good point.
It's that which is within. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with the second principle of Kwanzaa. It is self-determination. And the Swahili word is kujichagulia. I did it, didn't I, Anita? It's a rough one to pronounce, but it means to define ourselves, create for ourselves, and speak for ourselves. Kujichagulia is a day to focus on affirming the determination to create, name, and define life for yourself. So when we started looking into this concept of self-determination, and I was thinking about some reference in my own life, I began thinking about the women's movement and how the women's movement impacted me to exercise my own self-determination. I always felt that I just had a sense of, I don't know, rebelliousness or something, that I wasn't going to live my mom's life, right? And I read Betty Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, and I listened to all of this stuff. And I think it really did impact my life. But, later on, I started looking at films and reading more about women's suffrage, which is where the women's movement really took root. And Anita and I were chatting this morning about that. And we were talking about how it related to Black women. And I had a hard time thinking about how it related to Black women, because kind of in my mind, I had lumped all of us women together, that we were all fighting together. But the idea of self-determination and women's suffrage for Black women was different. And for me, I think that self-determination, the women's movement, unconsciously, I believed it was for me as a white person. I didn't think of myself that way, but I was not thinking about Black women at that time. And so, throughout the day today, I've been looking at different sources of how women have achieved self-determination. And for Pete's sake, this goes back hundreds of years. women have been fighting for their own right to be self-determined since, ancient times. The idea of not being owned or controlled by a man. And I certainly didn't go back that far. But let's start chatting a little bit with the women's suffrage movement, how in 1913, the women's suffrage group decided to march in Washington, D.C. when Woodrow Wilson was coming to town. He expected people to welcome him for the inauguration, but about 5,000 women had gathered, united by suffragist Alice Paul, and marched through Washington, to give themselves maximum exposure. But the kind of interesting thing is the women's group that had organized to do this march, there were kind of, if I understand it right, sort of sister organizations in the Black community, and they wanted to march with these white women that were fighting for, women's suffrage. And the white women said, well, you can march at the back. And my hero, Ida B. Wells, says, I'm not marching in the back. And so at first she decided not to march. And then she inserted herself right in the group with white women. And she is in this photograph of women at the march. And I mean, to me, that is the epitome of self-determination. She was not going to be separated as a woman. And Anita reminded me of Sojourner Truth, who had already experienced her own personal struggle towards freedom from slavery and remained unwavering in her support for women's rights. She took control of herself as a former slave. She says, I was bought and sold, but then she had her image put on postcards that she could sell for her own income. She says, now I'm selling and owning my own shadow, which is another really beautiful example of self-determination. But in this context of women marching, I'm not sure exactly of the timing, but Sojourner Truth said, ain't I a woman? Why would there be any separation? All women have the same struggles. However, in researching this today, I realized that with Black women, there were so many simultaneous struggles. There were racial struggles, there were financial struggles, there were hierarchical struggles, just all kinds of things. And this finally kind of drove home the point of intersectionality for me. I've been hearing this word and not really knowing what it meant, but not only were women fighting for their rights as women, they were fighting for their rights as Black people. And then, as time moves forward, gender issues and others. So let's see, there's a couple of buttes that I wanted to share with you. Sojourner said, I feel that I have the right to have just as much as a man. There's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored woman. And if colored men get their rights and colored women not theirs, the colored men will be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as before. I mean, that's very prescient for her, you think you're moving forward in small spaces, but white supremacy and male, patriarchy are still these rocks that are in place that women had to figure out how to get around over whatever. After this, the 15th Amendment was passed, was in 1870, without reference to sex as a protected category. Exhausted and embittered from the debate, split into two factions, let's see, they seemed to accept the society's claim that they were truly apolitical beings. So removing the term of men or women from the 15th Amendment gave all human beings the right to vote, which is amazing. It says some housewives were denounced, even denounced female suffrage, claiming that if women were to vote differently from their husbands, domestic unrest would surely follow. So, oh my gosh, the layers of all of this. It's amazing. So, let's see here. Among Black women who were staunch suffragists was Anna Julia Cooper, best known for her statement, and that is this: only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence or special patronage. Then and there, the whole Negro race enters with me. So that's pretty gorgeous, pretty powerful. Demonstrates that intersectionality again. Cooper was particularly effective in emphasizing to Black women that they required the ballot to counter the belief that Black men's experiences and needs were the same as theirs. So please, women, be politically active. Yeah, we have different problems and we all need to be voting members of society. So in terms of self-determination, this, again, started hundreds of years ago through various means. I can see that women and certainly African Americans will not ever stop seeking this equity, really, right? Equity, equality in the law, the ability to make their own choices and participate in society. And in the context of these community conversations, the only way for us to understand each other and what our needs are is to talk to each other personally, to really pull off the cover of who we appear to each other and talk deeply about how things affect us. Something just occurred to me as we were talking just now in the podcast, that a recent pastor of mine had a whole series on community, communitas, and this book about community. And I thought, what is he talking about? We are a community. We're in a community. It's Newark, New Jersey. What is he talking about? Now I think I need to reach out to him, but it is this very essence that you can get to, not through just showing up at church on Sundays, but through having conversations and knowing each other, knowing what each other needs. So that was a eureka moment for me. So any questions or additions to what I've just described, ladies?
Yeah, thank you, Mavis. That was pretty amazing. Thank you. One thing that I will point out is Sojourner Truth's speech, the Ain't I a Woman speech, actually occurred. She gave that speech at the Ohio Women's Convention in 1851.
51.
So she was there in 1851. Yeah.
Before the Civil War, right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So again, think about how all of this stuff connects across that historical spectrum. Like we cannot tease out the past and keep it separate from the present, nor can we tease it out and keep it separate from the future. It's a continuum. It's a spectrum of time.
Exactly. And nor can we tease out white accomplishments from Black accomplishments or vice versa.
Exactly.
Really, it's all going to come together. It must all come together. And that's when we're really going to make some serious progress. Yeah,
exactly.
We ride on the backs of these women. And there was one thing I read that called Frederick Douglass a male feminist. Which I'd like to read more about, men that started to understand what women were really fighting for.
Exactly. And so when I think about the idea of self-determination, it takes me back to Nelson Mandela, when Nelson Mandela, like I can remember that day when he walked out of prison. Everybody was kind of watching it on television and everything, this monumental day when he walked out of prison in 1990, in February of 1990. And his whole entire thing, like he was the leader of the anti-apartheid movement, which blossomed into this world movement, everybody speaking out against apartheid and all of that. And apartheid is an Afrikaans word for apartness. So when you speak in the vernacular or the American vernacular, it means segregation. And so during that time period, one of the things that was always so incredibly intriguing to me is here's all of this support around the world talking about, disrupting the anti-apartheid movement and all of that, including Americans. But then the question that was always in my mind is, how can we not recognize that the system of apartheid in its inequity and injustice that existed in South Africa was the same as the system of segregation with its inequity and injustice that existed right here in the United States? So that was just a very intriguing question to me. And then also because so much of Nelson Mandela's movement, anti-apartheid movement, was centered around this idea of self-determination. That is what segregation, that is what racism, that is what white supremacy robs you of, is this idea of self-determination.
And I can tell you, I never equated apartheid and segregation. Mm-hmm. This is when I was in grad school. We were not talking in those terms. And it's just surprising. But it's kind of our sense as Americans that we are that light on the hill, leading the world, always doing better than other countries. Yeah, my bad.
Exactly. Exactly. So again, I'm just loving this idea of community conversations, which includes these engaging dialogues and discussions of things like self-determination in our personal lives, our interpersonal lives, our community and social, at work and all of that. And this culture expresses self-determination. It comes through our arts, it comes through music, it comes through personal storytelling, it comes through historical narratives, all of this stuff, which is a function of self-determination. And I also link it to, as a woman of faith, I talk about my purpose. And I talk about the gifts, the uniqueness, my genius that God has given to me in order for me to do the things that he has purposed me to do. That is a part of self-determination.
Right.
Right?
That's right. Exactly. And, I want to add that if I had not had that conversation with you, Anita, this morning, I would have stayed in my white self, the white part of the women's movement. And when you and I began to talk, it opened the whole door on what Black women went through. We didn't just ride together shoulder to shoulder. We didn't. And Black women were dealing with so many other things simultaneously. White women too, maybe they weren't the same things, but in my mind, it was all white input. White writers that I was reading and so on.
Yes.
It would not, maybe someday I would have realized it, but until this morning, I sure didn't. Yeah.
And I also think of self-determination as something that requires you to overcome those stereotypes and those biases and those prejudices and all of those things that in the larger context attempts to define who I am as a Black person, right?
Yes.
And so in order for me to stand in my own self-determination, I have to be able to overcome all of that. I need to be able to be empowered within myself to move beyond somebody else's limited definition of who I can or cannot be. We can teach it to our kids. I teach Cairo self.
Oh, I'm sure.
Right.
Right.
So people like Cairo are going to be those emergent leaders, those torch bearers that are going to be, carrying this torch from Cairo's generation into the next generation. Right. And I just got the signal that we only have about 5 more minutes left in this conversation. So Gail, did you have any last minute things that you wanted to share before I go into our official closing?
And just to reiterate just what you've been talking about, I totally agree. It's as far as the women's suffrage and so forth, most white women don't think about the fact that Black women were represented, and it wasn't about them. But everybody, every human being has basic human rights that we need to respect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and put back in place.
Yes.
Back in place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So this is the part where I usually have a quote. So I've been torn between 2 quotes. So I'm going to read 2 quotes today. One of them comes from Scott Ellsworth, who is a historian and author of The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice. And he says, Greenwood wasn't just a place, but a state of mind. They had built this place. They had created it. It wasn't a gift from anybody. It was their own community. In Greenwood, everybody knew that they were just as good as anyone else. Very powerful words, right?
Very
powerful. The second quote actually comes from Dr. Karenga. This is our duty, to know our past and honor it, to engage our present and improve it, and to imagine a whole new future and forge it in the most ethical, effective, and expansive ways. So these quotes, I always relate back to our Cairo question, right? And as long as the Inflection Point podcast exists, I will always relate it back to the Cairo question. Will Cairo, 3-year-old Cairo, have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And as always, the final question is, what will you do to ensure that Cairo and his contemporaries have that birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which they were born? And so I'd like to invite members of our audience to you can go on Inflection Point Podcast in our Facebook group. So we do have a private Facebook group to engage in this conversation with your questions and comments. I would really like to see some of our audience members beginning to kind of engage in that group. It's right on Facebook, and it's under Inflection Point Podcast. So finally, I just want to thank you for joining us on this very first episode of Inflection Point Podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. And as a reminder, we are here every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time. And we are excited to see you in this new year as we immerse ourselves into a new theme of community conversations. So enjoy this season of upcoming celebrations. We already did Merry Christmas. We already did Happy Kwanzaa. So now it's just about, let's just go full force with everything that 2024 has to offer.
Amen.
Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.